The morning begins quietly in Wieliczka, a small town in southern Poland, just a few kilometers from the busier streets of Krakow. Wieliczka wakes the same way it has for centuries. Church bells drift across rooftops made of old clay tile. The air carries a faint coolness, the kind that belongs to early autumn mornings in the foothills, where the land begins its gentle rise toward the Carpathian Mountains in the distance. A few pigeons move along the edge of a stone fountain in the town square. A woman crosses the cobblestones slowly, carrying a canvas bag, her footsteps soft against the old pavement. A shopkeeper rolls up a metal shutter without any urgency. The sound travels down an empty side street and fades into silence. There is nothing about this morning that would suggest anything unusual. The town itself is pleasant and modest. Its architecture leans toward the Central European tradition, cream-colored facades, arched doorways, a few wooden benches near the church steps worn smooth by decades of use. Flower pots hang from iron balcony railings. A cat sits on a windowsill watching the square below with that particular stillness that only cats manage in the early hours. The light is pale and blue, barely warming the stones yet, and the whole scene carries the relaxed quality of a place that does not need to rush. And yet something is here that most towns do not have. It is not something that announces itself. There is no dramatic monument at the center of the square, no enormous sign declaring what lies below. The clue is subtle, a modest entrance building near the edge of the old town, its facade unremarkable, its doors the kind you would walk past without a second glance if you did not already know what they led to. Above those doors, carved in stone, a simple inscription marks the place, and just beyond them, a staircase descends, not a short staircase, not the kind that leads to a basement or a wine cellar. A staircase that leads downward for a very long time, into a world that most people standing in this square have never fully imagined. Beneath these quiet streets lies another world, not carved by rivers or volcanoes, but by thousands of ordinary people whose work slowly transformed darkness into something almost impossible to believe. The descent begins gradually. The first steps are wooden. Old timber, worn smooth and slightly curved in the center from generations of feet, creaks softly underfoot. The staircase winds downward in a tight spiral, and as it does, the sounds of the street above fade with each passing second. The bells grow quieter. The distant hum of traffic disappears, the morning light narrows to a single pale rectangle far above, and then even that is gone. What replaces it is something harder to describe, not exactly silence, because the mine is never completely silent, but a deep and settled quiet, the kind that has weight to it, that presses gently against the ears and asks the body to slow down. The air changes almost immediately. It becomes cooler and slightly damp, carrying with it a scent that is difficult to place at first, mineral, clean, faintly sharp, like the air near the sea on a winter morning. This is the smell of salt. Not the light salt of an ocean breeze, but something older and more concentrated, a smell that comes from rock itself, from stone that was once an ancient sea floor and has been resting in darkness for millions of years. The walls of the staircase are rough at first, reinforced with timber supports that press close on either side. The wood is dark with age, the grain raised and textured, the joints fitted with iron bolts that have turned a deep reddish brown. Every few steps, a small light glows from a bracket on the wall, modern electric lamps, but installed discreetly so they cast warm pools of amber light rather than the flat brightness of fluorescent tubes. The effect is something between a mine shaft and a chapel corridor, and it creates an atmosphere that is impossible to fully prepare for. At around 30 meters below the surface, the staircase levels into a horizontal corridor. The ceiling is low here, not so low that one must crouch, but low enough to feel close, attentive, as though the mine itself is leaning in. The walls glisten. Small crystals catch the lamplight and return it in brief, scattered flashes. The salt is everywhere, in the walls, in the floor, in the ceiling above, and it makes the rock shimmer faintly in a way that feels entirely unexpected for something so ancient. The corridor stretches ahead, and the eye follows it naturally, looking for what comes next. This is the Wieliczka Salt Mine, one of the oldest continuously operating salt mines in the world, and one of the most remarkable underground spaces ever created by human hands. But to understand how it became what it is today, it is necessary to begin at the beginning, not with the miners who carved its most famous chambers, not with the chapels or the chandeliers or the underground lakes, but with something far older and far more patient. It is necessary to begin with the ground itself, because the mine did not begin as a wonder, it began as work, hard, daily, unglamorous work, the kind that fills lifetimes without offering recognition. And yet, across those lifetimes, something extraordinary happened. The wonder grew quietly, chamber by chamber, carved slowly from the darkness, until one day, though no single day can truly be named, it had become something that people traveled across continents to see. Why would people spend centuries building an entire world beneath the surface, in the cold and the dark, far from sunlight and sky? That question descends with us into the salt. Long before there was a mine, long before there were miners, long before Poland existed as a nation or Wieliczka existed as a town, there was a sea. It spread across what is now Central Europe in a vast, shallow inland basin, not the kind of ocean one imagines when thinking of deep Atlantic waters, but a warm, relatively shallow body of water that geologists call the Paratethys Sea. This ancient sea existed during the Miocene epoch, roughly 13 to 15 million years ago, and it covered a broad region stretching from what is now Austria in the west to the Caspian Basin in the east. Its waters were warm and mineral-rich, and like all enclosed or semi-enclosed seas, it was vulnerable to changes in the surrounding landscape. Over millions of years, the great tectonic forces that were building the Alps and the Carpathian Mountains began to shift the land. Gradually, the passages that connected the Paratethys to the open ocean grew narrower. The sea's connection to freshwater inflows became irregular. In some periods, the sea expanded, in others, it contracted. And during the long, slow periods of contraction, when the climate was warm enough and the evaporation rates high enough, the dissolved minerals in the seawater began to concentrate. This is a process called evaporite formation, and it works with a beautiful, patient logic. As water evaporates from a shallow sea, the salts and minerals dissolved within it have nowhere to go. They remain behind, becoming more concentrated with each passing year, until eventually the water can no longer hold them in solution. At that point, the minerals begin to crystallize. They fall, grain by grain, layer by layer, to the sea floor, where they accumulate over thousands of years into beds of crystallized salt. What was happening beneath what is now southern Poland was precisely this. The ancient paratethys, contracting and evaporating through long Miocene summers, deposited layer after layer of crystallized sodium chloride, common salt, onto the floor of its shrinking basin. These layers built up over immense stretches of geological time, eventually forming beds of rock salt that ran deep into the earth, compressed and preserved beneath later layers of clay, sand, and gravel. The Carpathian Mountains continue to rise around this basin. Plate movements pushed sedimentary layers upward and folded them in complex ways, sealing the ancient salt deposits beneath hundreds of meters of accumulated rock. The sea that had created them was gone, replaced by meadows, rivers, and eventually by farmland and towns. But the salt remained, locked in the darkness below, perfectly preserved by pressure and by time. Rock salt, unlike many minerals, is remarkably stable when sealed away from air and water. It does not corrode. It does not dissolve in the absence of moisture. Left undisturbed, it simply waits, patient beyond any human scale of patience, holding within its crystalline structure the chemical memory of an ancient sea that no living creature has ever seen. At Wieliczka, the salt deposit runs to a depth of approximately 300 meters. The total thickness of the salt-bearing strata is considerable, wide enough, deep enough, and uniform enough to have supported centuries of extraction without exhausting the deposit completely. The rock salt here takes several forms. In some areas it appears as dense, gray-green stone, compact and smooth when freshly cut, almost like marble in the way it accepts light. In other areas, it is more granular, softer, crumbling slightly at the edges where it has been exposed to the mine's air. And in certain places, the salt forms natural crystals of unusual clarity, transparent and pale, catching lamplight with a quality that seems more appropriate to a jeweler's case than to the wall of an underground tunnel. The geological story of Wieliczka is, in a sense, a story about time operating at a scale that the human mind can only approximate. 13 million years is not a number that carries emotional weight the way that 100 years does, or even 1,000. It sits at the edge of comprehension, a duration so vast that it makes the entire span of human civilization, from the first cities of Mesopotamia to the present day, seem like a brief afternoon. And yet the salt that miners have been cutting from these walls since the Middle Ages was already ancient, before the first human being ever looked up at the stars. Understanding this geological depth is important not just as scientific background, but as a way of feeling the full weight of what walking through the mine actually means. Every wall, every carved pillar, every smoothed floor, all of it is made from material that was once part of a living sea. The crystalline surfaces that glimmer in the lamplight are the compressed remnants of ocean water that evaporated under a sun that shone on a world unrecognizably different from our own. Nature created the conditions. Nature deposited the salt. Nature preserved it in the dark. But nature did not carve the corridors. Nature did not shape the pillars or the arches or the chambers. Nature did not raise the altars or hang the chandeliers or polish the floors to a soft, grey smoothness. All of that came later, and all of it came from human hands. The transformation from geological deposit to underground masterpiece required something that no geological process could provide: intention. The desire to go deeper, to reach further, to take what the earth offered and shape it not only into useful commodity, but eventually into something that transcended usefulness entirely. That transformation began, as most great transformations do, with something entirely practical. It began with the need for salt. Salt in the medieval world was not a seasoning. Or rather, it was not only a seasoning, it was something closer to a form of currency, a strategic resource, and a matter of survival. Before refrigeration, before canning, before any of the modern methods of food preservation that now seem so ordinary as to be invisible, salt was the primary means by which meat, fish, and vegetables could be stored through the winter months. Without sufficient salt, communities faced not merely inconvenience but genuine scarcity, the inability to preserve the harvest, to prepare for the cold months, to feed armies, to supply cities. Salt determined whether populations survived lean years or did not. It shaped trade routes. It supported entire economies. It was taxed, regulated, and fought over by kings and nobles across medieval Europe, with an intensity that is difficult to appreciate from the vantage point of a world where salt is the least expensive item in any grocery store. The region around Wieliczka had been known for its saline springs since at least the early medieval period. Surface seeps and brine springs, places where naturally salt water bubbled up through the ground, had been used by local people for centuries before anyone thought to dig. The early method was simple: collect the brine from the spring, boil it in large pans over open fires, allow the water to evaporate, and collect the salt crystals that remained. This process, called salt panning, was labor-intensive and fuel-hungry, but it required no complex engineering and could be conducted at the surface with relatively modest tools. Historical records suggest that organized salt production in the Wieliczka area dates back to at least the 12th century, though local traditions and some archaeological evidence point to even earlier activity. The transition from brine collection at the surface to actual underground mining, digging down into the rock salt deposit itself, is believed to have begun in the 13th century, though the precise date remains a matter of ongoing historical research rather than settled certainty. What is documented with considerably more confidence is the growing royal interest in the salt deposits of this region. The Piast dynasty, the ruling house of medieval Poland, recognized the extraordinary commercial value of the Wieliczka salt works and placed them under direct royal control. The mines became known as the Wieliczka and Bochnia Royal Salt Mines, one of the most significant sources of revenue in the Polish kingdom and a resource jealously protected by successive monarchs. The Polish term for this salt revenue was a telling one. The mines were described as contributing to the country's wealth, in a way that contemporaries compared to a perpetual harvest from the earth, a reliable, inexhaustible income that helped finance everything from royal courts to military campaigns, at the height of their economic importance. During the 14th and 15th centuries, the salt mines of Wieliczka and the nearby town of Bochnia together contributed a significant portion of the entire Polish royal treasury's income. Some historical accounts suggest figures as high as 30% in certain periods. Though economic historians treat such precise figures with appropriate caution given the complexity of medieval accounting, the earliest underground workings were, by later standards, extremely modest. The miners of the 13th and 14th centuries followed the natural surface seeps downward, digging shafts through the soft clay and gravel layers above the salt deposit, and then cutting horizontally into the rock salt itself. Their tools were iron picks, wooden shovels, and leather buckets. Their light came from tallow candles mounted on iron holders driven into the salt walls. Their ventilation was whatever air drifted naturally through the shafts above, supplemented, as the mines grew deeper, by simple wooden fans and bellows worked by hand. The rock salt proved to be an unusual material to work with. Softer than ordinary stone, it could be cut with iron tools without the exhausting difficulty that granite or limestone imposed. A skilled miner with a good pick could carve through rock salt at a reasonable pace, not quickly by any modern standard, but efficiently enough that chambers could be carved out over the course of weeks or months rather than years. The salt also had the advantage of structural stability. When carved into arched or vaulted shapes, it was capable of supporting considerable weight without collapsing, provided the shapes were chosen carefully and the surrounding rock was not disturbed more than necessary. Timber was critical from the very beginning. As shafts were sunk and horizontal tunnels extended outward from them, the surrounding earth and clay above the salt layer needed to be supported. The miners used heavy wooden beams, oak and pine, brought from forests in the surrounding region, to shore up the ceilings and walls of their tunnels. These timber frames, called sets or cribs in mining terminology, were fitted together with considerable precision, the joints cut and matched by craftsmen who combined the skills of a carpenter with an intimate knowledge of underground pressure and ground movement. The horses came early as well. As the mine expanded and the distances from the shaft grew greater, the problem of transporting salt from the cutting face to the surface became significant. Horses were lowered into the mine, a logistically complex undertaking. Accomplished by means of large wooden winch systems operated by human or animal power at the surface. And once underground, these horses spent most of their working lives below the surface pulling sledges and later wheeled carts along the tunnel floors. Historical records from later centuries mention horses that were born underground that lived and worked in the mine for years without ever returning to the surface, a detail that carries a particular quietness. A reminder that the world of the mine was not merely a place that humans visited, but an environment that shaped the lives of every creature within it. The winches themselves, large wooden wheels fitted with ropes or chains, were the mechanical heart of the early mine. Positioned at the tops of the main shafts, they were turned by horses walking in circles at the surface, winding up the ropes that lifted baskets and buckets of salt from the depths below. The creaking of these great wooden wheels, the sound of rope under tension, the rhythmic plodding of the horses, these were the constant acoustic backdrop of daily life at Wieliczka for several centuries. And in the depths below, in the pale, crystalline light of their candles, the miners worked. Their shifts were long, their tools were heavy. The temperature underground was constant, around 14 degrees Celsius throughout the year, which was cool enough to require warm clothing, but not so cold as to prevent sustained physical labor. The air in the shallower parts of the mine was breathable, though the deeper the miners worked, the more careful they had to be about ventilation. Salt dust in the lungs was a long-term hazard, though the miners of earlier centuries would not have described it in such terms. They knew only that deep work made men cough, and that men who spent too many years in the deepest passages sometimes did not grow old. Despite the hardships, the mine attracted workers generation after generation, partly because it paid relatively well by the standards of the time, partly because the surrounding town grew up specifically to support it and offered no other comparable employment, and partly because mining, like most skilled trades, passed from father to son through the patient accumulation of knowledge that could not be written in books, but only demonstrated with hands in the dark. By the end of the 14th century, the mine at Wieliczka had grown considerably beyond the modest initial workings of the previous century. The shafts had deepened, the horizontal tunnels had extended, new chambers had been carved to store salt awaiting transport. The timber framework had grown more complex and more carefully engineered. And the number of people involved in the mine's operation, not only the miners themselves, but the craftsmen, the administrators, the horses and their handlers, the women who processed and packaged the salt at the surface, had grown into a small community built entirely around the underground resource. The mine was becoming, very slowly and without any deliberate plan, something more than a mine. But that transformation, the transformation from working mine to underground world, would take many more centuries to complete, and it would require more than practical necessity to accomplish it. It would require something that no engineer and no administrator had included in any early plan: the quiet, persistent human impulse to make a difficult place beautiful. There is a particular kind of problem that only reveals itself underground. On the surface, a builder can walk around a structure, observe it from different angles, check the sky for weather, feel the ground beneath their feet for stability. If something shifts or settles, the evidence is visible: a crack in a wall, a sagging roof, a door that no longer closes properly. The feedback is immediate, and the corrections can be made before anything becomes dangerous. Underground, none of that is available. The miner and the underground engineer work in a world where the forces acting on a structure come from every direction simultaneously. From above, where the weight of hundreds of meters of overlying rock presses downward from the sides. Where the surrounding salt and clay push inward with pressures that vary depending on depth, moisture content, and the shape of the excavation, and even from below, where water movement or settling can shift the floor of a chamber without warning. there is no sky to read. There is no horizon to reference. The feedback when it comes arrives as sound, a low creak in a timber beam, a faint pop from the salt wall, the soft trickling of water where no water should be, and interpreting those sounds correctly. Knowing which sounds to worry about and which to dismiss was a skill built across entire careers spent in the dark. The engineers and master miners of Wieliczka developed this skill across centuries, and the underground city that resulted from their accumulated knowledge represents one of the most sustained exercises in practical engineering in the pre-modern world. The fundamental challenge was structural stability. As the mine expanded horizontally, as tunnels extended outward from the central shafts in multiple directions, as chambers were carved to store salt, to house equipment, to provide working space, the volume of material being removed from the rock mass increased. And the more material was removed, the greater the risk that the surrounding rock would shift, settle, or collapse inward. Managing this risk was not a theoretical problem solved on paper. It was a daily, physical negotiation between the miners and the earth around them. The earliest solution, and the one that remained fundamental throughout the mine's active period, was the system of pillars. Rather than removing all the salt from a given area, the miners learned to leave behind substantial columns of intact rock salt, evenly spaced through each working level, to bear the weight of the ceiling above. These pillars were carved to specific shapes, roughly rectangular, with slightly tapering profiles that distributed the load most effectively, and they were positioned according to proportions that the miners refined through long experience. The height of the chamber, the thickness of the ceiling between levels, the spacing of the pillars, the width of the passages between them, all of these dimensions were calibrated not by formal calculation in the modern engineering sense, but by accumulated knowledge tested against the evidence of what had worked and what had not. Some of the early chambers failed. Historical records from the 15th and 16th centuries mention collapses, passages that had to be abandoned, sections of the mine where the salt had moved unexpectedly and sealed off tunnels that were no longer safe to enter. These failures were not catalogued with the systematic detail that a modern engineering report would provide, but they are present in the administrative records of the mine as economic events. The loss of a working face, the cost of reopening a blocked passage, the reassignment of workers from areas that could no longer be safely operated. Each failure, however quietly recorded, was a lesson. The timber framing system grew more sophisticated across the 14th and 15th centuries. Early timber supports had been relatively simple, single beams spanning a tunnel ceiling, propped from the sides by upright posts. As the mine deepened and the chambers grew larger, these simple frames were replaced by more complex structures, interlocking grids of beams, fitted with cross-bracing to resist lateral as well as vertical movement, joined at corners with mortise and tenon joints that locked the structure together without relying entirely on iron fastenings. The carpentry required for this work was of a high standard, and the men who performed it, known in the mine's records by various titles that translate roughly as master carpenters or timber workers, occupied a specialized and respected role within the mine's workforce. The problem of water was equally persistent. Rock salt is stable in the absence of moisture, but it dissolves readily in water. In a mine that depended on the structural integrity of its salt walls and pillars, the management of underground water was a constant and critical concern. The Wieliczka deposit was not entirely dry, natural groundwater percolated through cracks and fissures in the overlying clay layers, finding its way down into the mine workings, particularly in areas where the mining had disturbed the natural drainage patterns of the rock above. The miners dealt with this water through an extensive system of drainage channels carved directly into the floor of the tunnels, shallow grooves that directed water toward collection sumps at the base of each shaft, from which it could be lifted to the surface by pumps. The early pumps were simple devices, leather bags or wooden buckets raised by winch. But as the mine deepened and the volume of water increased, more sophisticated pumping machinery was developed. By the 17th century, the mine employed elaborate wooden pump systems powered by horses at the surface, capable of lifting significant volumes of water from considerable depths. Ventilation was the third great engineering challenge. Fresh air at the surface is easy to take for granted. Underground, the supply of breathable air is finite, unless actively managed. Working miners consume oxygen and produce carbon dioxide. Candles and oil lamps consume oxygen and produce combustion gases. And in certain areas of the mine, natural gas, primarily methane, seeped from organic material trapped within the salt strata. In the early centuries of the mine's operation, this last hazard was particularly dangerous, and the mine's records from the medieval and early modern periods include accounts of gas explosions caused when a miner's candle ignited accumulated methane in a poorly ventilated passage. These events were not frequent, but they were serious enough to prompt the development of specialized ventilation techniques. The primary ventilation strategy at Wieliczka involved the careful management of airflow through the mine's shaft system. By controlling which shafts were open to the surface and which were partially sealed, and by positioning internal partitions within tunnels to direct airflow along specific routes, the mine's administrators created a system of natural air circulation that drew fresh air down through some shafts and exhaled stale air up through others. Wooden doors and baffles, simple but precisely placed, were used to maintain these circulation patterns even as the mine expanded and the airflow routes changed. In areas where natural circulation was insufficient, bellows were used, large leather bellows, operated by hand or by mechanical means, to push fresh air along particularly deep or remote passages. The men who operated these bellows held a specific role in the mine's workforce, and their work, though unglamorous, was as essential to the mine's continued operation as any other task performed underground. What is remarkable about all of this engineering is not any single innovation. None of the individual solutions employed at Wieliczka was unique to that mine. Pileandrum mining, timber framing, drainage channels, ventilation baffles, these techniques were used in underground mines across Europe during the same period. What was remarkable was the scale and the duration over which they were applied, and the degree to which successive generations of engineers and miners built upon the knowledge of their predecessors, rather than beginning again from uncertainty each time a new problem arose. The mine kept records. This is, historically speaking, unusual for a working mine of the medieval period, and it reflects the degree of administrative sophistication that the royal ownership of the mine required. The records were not always detailed by modern standards, and they were not consistent across all periods, but they existed: account books, administrative reports, descriptions of significant events, and engineering decisions. These records became, over time, a kind of institutional memory that allowed the mine to accumulate knowledge in ways that a purely oral tradition could not fully support. By the 16th century, the mine at Wieliczka had reached a depth of more than 100 meters, with multiple working levels extending horizontally from several main shafts. The total length of its tunnels was already considerable, enough that a person walking through all of them without repetition would cover a distance measured in tens of kilometers. The underground world had acquired a complexity that surpassed anything that had been imagined when the first shafts were sunk. And still the question remains: how could this underground city survive for centuries without the entire structure collapsing under the weight of everything above it? The answer ultimately is not a single clever solution, but the accumulation of thousands of small, careful decisions made in lamplight in cold air, by people whose names are mostly lost to history, each one a modest act of engineering that added to all the others became something extraordinary. That quiet accumulation, repeated across generation after generation, was the real engineering achievement of Wieliczka. The mine did not survive because someone solved it. It survived because thousands of people kept solving it, day after day, in the dark. To walk through the tunnels of Wieliczka today is to walk through a space that has been shaped by human presence so thoroughly and for so long that the human is inseparable from the place. The walls carry marks, chisel marks, where a miner's tool caught the salt at a particular angle and left a shallow groove that has never been smoothed away. The floor carries the shallow, slight depression of a path worn by feet, thousands and thousands of feet crossing the same stones over the same years. A timber beam shows the grain of wood that was cut from a specific tree in a specific forest, selected by someone who knew what he needed and knew where to find it. These are not dramatic traces, they are quiet ones. But they accumulate, the way all quiet things accumulate across centuries, into something that fills the air of the mine with a sense of inhabited time. The miners of Wieliczka came, in the earliest centuries, primarily from the town itself and from the surrounding villages. Mining was generational work, the kind of knowledge and skill that passed from father to son, from uncle to nephew, from experienced miner to young apprentice, through years of working together in the dark. A boy might enter the mine for the first time in his early adolescence, assigned initially to the lightest and least technical tasks, carrying tools, operating bellows, leading horses along tunnel floors, holding lights for the men doing the cutting. Over years, he would learn watching, listening, trying, being corrected, until he understood the salt well enough to work a cutting face himself. This knowledge was not easily codified. It lived in the body as much as in the mind, in the feel of a pick handle vibrating differently when the salt was soft versus when it was approaching a harder layer, in the sound of a particular kind of creak from a timber support that meant it was settling normally versus a different creak that meant it needed attention, in the smell of the air near a sealed passage that suggested water or gas behind it. These were not things that could be learned from a book, because no book existed that could capture them. They existed only in the practiced attention of experienced miners, and they were transmitted only through proximity and time. The working day underground was long by any measure. Records from the 16th and 17th centuries suggest shifts of 8 to 12 hours, depending on the period and the nature of the work. The miners worked by candlelight, each miner responsible for his own supply of candles, a detail that appears in the mine's administrative records as a recurring expense and a source of occasional dispute. The candles were made from tallow, producing a warm but limited light that illuminated perhaps a meter or two of the surrounding space clearly before the darkness absorbed the rest. Working in this light for extended periods required the eyes to adapt, and miners developed the habit of positioning their candles with great care wedged into crevices in the salt wall or fixed to iron holders driven into the rock, so that the light fell most usefully on the work in front of them. Meals were eaten underground. This detail, small as it seems, carries considerable weight when considered carefully. The miners did not surface at midday for a break and a meal. The journey to the surface and back would have consumed too much of the working day and too much physical energy. Instead, food was brought down to the mine: bread, smoked meat, dried fish, cheese, and water or weak beer, and eaten in the tunnels or in the larger storage chambers, sitting on blocks of salt or on wooden crates in the cool, mineral-scented air with the sounds of the mine around them. It was not a comfortable lunch by any measure, but it was part of the rhythm of underground life, and it meant that the miner's daily existence was organized almost entirely around the mine and its demands. Women worked in and around the mine as well, though their roles were generally different from those of the underground miners. At the surface, women were involved in the processing and packaging of salt, sorting, measuring, wrapping, and loading the finished product for transport. Some women worked as traders, selling salt in the local markets, or managing the small enterprises that grew up to supply the mine with the various goods it required. The wives and mothers of miners occupied the particular position of people whose households were shaped by a workplace they could not fully enter, always aware of the mine's rhythms, always alert to its accidents, always managing the domestic consequences of work that happened out of sight. The risks of mining were real and consistent across all periods. Cave-ins were the most dramatic and most feared: the sudden failure of a ceiling or a wall, the cascade of rock and salt that could trap or kill men in seconds. But the slower dangers were, in their own way, equally significant. Respiratory problems from years of breathing salt dust and candle smoke were common among older miners, though they were not necessarily recognized as occupationally caused in the earlier centuries. Injuries from falls, from moving equipment, from the simple mechanics of heavy physical work in confined spaces, were frequent enough to appear regularly in the mine's records as reasons for payments or adjustments to work assignments. There were also the fires. The mine's timber structures, the massive investment in wooden supports, frames, and equipment that represented centuries of carpentry, were vulnerable to fire in ways that the salt rock around them was not. Candles tipped over, sparks from iron tools striking stone, accidental contact between flame and the dry, aging wood of old timber supports. Any of these could start a fire in the mine, and a fire underground was extremely difficult to fight. The most serious historical fires at Wieliczka caused significant damage to parts of the mine's structure and required extensive and costly repair, and the administrative records treat these events with a seriousness that reflects the real danger they posed. And yet the community persisted. The mine, for all its dangers, offered something that kept generation after generation returning to its darkness: a livelihood, a community, and a form of identity that was distinct and recognized. The miners of Wieliczka were not a faceless mass of undifferentiated labor. They were a community with its own internal hierarchy, its own traditions, its own language of shared experience. The hierarchy of the mine was carefully defined. At the top of the underground workforce were the master miners, experienced, skilled men who supervised the work of cutting faces and made the practical engineering decisions about where to extend a tunnel, how to support a new chamber, when to abandon a section that had become unsafe. Below them were the working miners themselves, organized by seniority and specialization: cutters, haulers, timbermen, pump operators, horse handlers. At the bottom were the apprentices and general laborers, doing the work that required hands and willingness more than skill. This hierarchy was not rigid in the way that a modern corporate structure is rigid. The relationships within it were personal, maintained by the same kind of face-to-face daily interaction that characterizes all communities in which people work closely together in difficult conditions. A master miner knew the men under him, knew their strengths, their limitations, their family situations, their particular habits underground. The mine was small enough in human terms that this kind of knowledge was possible. One of the clearest expressions of the community that the mine created was its tradition of underground worship. Miners, throughout the history of Wieliczka, maintained a strong religious practice, and not merely at the surface. They prayed underground. They maintained small shrines at the working faces, little niches carved into the salt walls where a candle could be placed before a carved image or a simple cross. They observed religious festivals in a way that the mine accommodated rather than interrupted. And over time, gradually, quietly, and through the devotion of individual miners who chose to invest their off hours in something that served the whole community, these simple shrines grew into something far more substantial. The mine began to fill with art, not art commissioned by kings or bishops. Not art produced by professional sculptors working in warm, well-lit studios. Art made by miners in their spare hours, in the cold and the dark, using the same tools they used for their daily work, carving from the same salt that constituted every wall around them. It is worth pausing here in the telling of this story to let that detail settle. These were working men, men whose hands were rough from iron tools, whose eyes were accustomed to candlelight, whose days were spent in physical labor. And in their free time, in the mine that had taken their fathers and would take their sons, they chose to make things of beauty. They carved figures, they carved reliefs, they carved chapels, not all at once and not according to any grand plan. But steadily, over generations, the impulse to make the underground world something more than functional, something that reflected the spiritual and artistic life of the people who lived within it, transformed the mine in ways that no engineering blueprint had ever anticipated. The mine was becoming, in the hands of the people who worked it, a kind of cathedral. There is a chamber deep within the Wieliczka mine that stops people in their tracks, not because it announces itself dramatically or because a guide says something particularly remarkable before you enter it. It stops people because of a simple disjunction between expectation and reality, because the mind, having followed narrow corridors through salt-grey walls for some time, is not prepared for the scale and the beauty of what suddenly opens up. The Chapel of St. Kinga, Kaplica SW. Kingi in Polish is not a room in a mine. It is, in every meaningful sense, a cathedral. The ceiling rises to 12 meters above the floor. The floor itself is smooth and grey, the salt polished to a soft sheen by the passage of feet over many years. The walls are carved in bas-relief, intricate scenes from scripture and from the life of the chapel's patron saint, rendered in salt with a precision and an expressiveness that would be impressive in any material. Chandeliers hang from the ceiling, great rings of salt crystal that have been shaped and fitted together into forms of considerable elegance, lit from within by electric light that replaced the candles and oil lamps of earlier centuries. Altarpieces stand against the far wall, carved in the same grey-green salt, the figures depicted with a stillness and solemnity that seems entirely appropriate to the underground space around them. The dimensions of the chapel are, in the context of an underground space, extraordinary. It is 54 meters long, 17 meters wide, and 12 meters high. These are not the dimensions of a small mining shrine. They are the dimensions of a significant church, one that could, and regularly does, hold hundreds of people for services and concerts. The acoustics, shaped by the irregular carved surfaces of the salt walls, produce a reverberation that gives music performed here a quality unlike anything achievable in a conventional hall. The sound seems to inhabit the stone itself, to fill the chamber the way water fills a vessel. To linger and settle rather than simply ceasing. The chapel's creation spans several centuries and the contributions of several generations of minor artists. The beginnings were modest. Like the other chapels and shrines scattered throughout the mine, the Chapel of St. Kinga started as a small working space, a chamber carved for practical purposes that miners gradually began to decorate with religious imagery. The tradition of underground worship at Wieliczka predates the formal chapels. By many generations, miners had maintained small shrines at their working faces, since at least the 14th century, placing carved figures of saints in niches above the places where they worked, praying before them at the beginning and end of shifts. Saint Kinga herself, the patron saint of the mine and of the miners, is a figure who bridges the historical and the legendary in ways that require both to be acknowledged without confusing one for the other. The historical Kinga was a 13th-century princess of Hungary, daughter of King Bela IV, who married Bolesław V of Poland around 1239. She was known during her lifetime for her religious devotion and her charitable works, and she was canonized by Pope John Paul II in 1999, making her, as saints go, a relatively recently formalized one, though her local veneration had been practiced for many centuries before the official canonization. The documented record of Kinga's life establishes her as a real historical figure of the 13th century, a woman of considerable influence and genuine religious conviction who founded several religious houses in Poland and left a lasting mark on the communities she patronized. Her connection to the Wieliczka mine, however, belongs to a different category of knowledge, not historical documentation, but legend, and it is important to hold that distinction clearly. The legend of Saint Kinga and the salt mine will be explored more fully in a later chapter of this story. What matters here in the context of the chapels is that her legend gave the mine's underground worship tradition its central figure, the saint through whom the miners understood their relationship to the place where they worked. The spiritual protector whose image they carved first into small niches and eventually into the walls of an underground cathedral. The main period of the chapel's major expansion and elaboration occurred in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when two miners, Joseph Markowski and Antoni Wirodek, took on the task of dramatically expanding the existing modest chamber into the grand space that exists today. Working during their off hours, using mining tools adapted for sculptural purposes, these two men and later others who joined the project spent decades carving the bas-reliefs, shaping the altarpieces, and enlarging the chamber to its present dimensions. Joseph Markowski began his work on the chapel in approximately 1895, and the project continued, with interruptions and contributions from other minor artists, through the early decades of the 20th century. The figures depicted in the bas-reliefs are carved with a directness and an emotional authenticity that reflects the tradition from which they came, not the polished sophistication of academic sculpture, but something more immediate, more devotional, more expressive of genuine belief than of artistic ambition. The Last Supper, rendered in bas-relief along one wall, depicts Christ and the apostles at a table that feels oddly familiar in its arrangement. The figures grouped naturally, the scene neither idealized into academic perfection nor caricatured by lack of skill, but simply present. Rendered with the care of a man who took the subject seriously and worked on it for years. The chandeliers deserve particular attention. They are made of salt crystals, not natural formations left in place, but individual crystals selected, shaped, and assembled into chandelier forms by hand. The crystals used are of the clearer, more transparent variety found in certain parts of the deposit, and when lit from within, they produce a quality of light that is simultaneously warm and slightly cool. The yellow of the bulbs filtered through the pale gray-white of the salt crystal into something that seems to belong to neither artificial light nor natural light, but to a category of its own. The effect of standing in this space, the scale, the carved reliefs, the chandelier light reflecting from the salt floor, the faint sound of one's own footsteps in the silence, is difficult to describe without resorting to words that carry more drama than the space itself projects. The chapel is not overwhelming. It is not theatrical. It is, if anything, more quietly affecting than dramatically impressive, the kind of beauty that requires time to register properly, that grows rather than shocks. There are other chapels within the mine, smaller than the chapel of St. Kinga, but no less carefully made. The chapel of St. Anthony, excavated in the 17th century, is one of the oldest underground religious spaces in the mine, a more modest chamber than St. Kinga's, but one whose age gives it a particular quality, a sense of time lived within its walls. The chapel of St. Cross and the chapel of the Blessed Kinga's Grotto are among the others, each one the product of individual devotion expressed over years of carving, each one a small community of meaning within the larger underground world. What unites all of them, beyond their religious purpose, is the material from which they are made and the hands that made them. Salt is not an obvious choice for sacred art. It is the material of labor, of commerce, of everyday utility. It is not marble or limestone or the polished wood of altarpieces in surface churches. It does not carry the associations of preciousness that art materials typically do, and yet, in the hands of the Wieliczka miners, salt became something genuinely sacred, not because it was transformed into a material it was not, but because it was used with such patience and such care that its own qualities, the way it holds light, the texture of its surface, the faint translucence of its clearer varieties, the grey-green solidity of its denser forms, became the aesthetic vocabulary of a tradition unlike any other in the world. Nowhere else on Earth has an underground salt deposit been transformed into a place of religious art and community worship at this scale and over this duration. The chapels of Wieliczka are not replicas of surface churches moved underground. They are something original, spaces invented by the people who worked in the mine to meet a need that the mine itself had created using the materials that the mine provided, and reflecting the particular spiritual and aesthetic sensibilities of a community that spent its working life in the dark. They are, in the truest sense of the word, unique, and they remain, even today, in active use. The chapel of St. Kinga still holds regular religious services. Weddings and concerts take place within it. The space continues to be a living part of the mine's community rather than simply a preserved historical exhibit. That continuity, the fact that people still come down into the earth to worship in a space carved from salt by the hands of miners who died a century ago, may be the most remarkable thing about the chapels. Not their scale, not their artistry, but their continued life. There is a particular quality to getting lost underground that is unlike getting lost anywhere else. On the surface, disorientation carries with it the consolation of landmarks, a hill on the horizon, the position of the sun, the direction a river flows, the sound of traffic from a nearby road. Even in dense forest or open desert, the sky remains above and the ground remains below, and that simple orientation, vertical, constant, reliable, provides a foundation from which the lost person can begin to reason their way back toward familiarity. Underground, the sky disappears. The horizon disappears. The cardinal directions become meaningless without instruments to detect them. The only dimension that remains consistently interpretable is the vertical, up toward the surface. Down away from it, and even that can become uncertain in a mine whose levels slope and twist and intersect in ways that defeat the intuitive sense of depth that serves so well above ground. The Wieliczka mine is not a place where one is likely to get physically lost today. It is well mapped, well lit, and well guided. The visitor routes are clearly marked and carefully maintained, but to stand at a junction in one of the older, less visited corridors, to look down a tunnel that extends beyond the range of the nearest lamp and disappears into a darkness that the eye cannot penetrate, is to feel briefly and safely the quality of the underground labyrinth that the mine actually is. The numbers associated with the mine's scale are, by any standard, extraordinary. The mine currently has 9 levels, descending from approximately 64 meters below the surface at the shallowest to approximately 327 meters at the deepest. The total length of all tunnels, corridors, shafts, and chambers within the mine is approximately 300 kilometers. This is not a figure that is easy to visualize. 300 kilometers of underground passage is roughly the distance from the center of Warsaw to the center of Gdansk traveled by road. Laid end to end, the tunnels of Wieliczka would constitute a substantial journey across the surface of Poland. Underground, they constitute a labyrinth of almost incomprehensible complexity. The mine contains approximately 2,000 underground chambers of various sizes, ranging from small storage niches barely large enough to stand in to vast working chambers and the grand spaces of the decorated halls and chapels. These chambers are connected by the network of tunnels, which run horizontally along each level and vertically between levels through shafts and inclined passages. The overall structure is not a simple grid. It is an organic growth shaped by the distribution of the salt deposit, by the engineering decisions of successive generations of miners, and by the history of expansion, abandonment, and occasional collapse that has left some areas accessible and others permanently sealed. Navigation through this structure, before the era of modern surveying instruments and electric lighting, was a genuine challenge. The earliest miners worked in relatively small sections of the mine and relied on familiarity, the knowledge of a specific area built through years of daily work in it, rather than on any formal map or systematic understanding of the whole. As the mine expanded beyond the range of any individual's direct experience, the need for more systematic navigation became apparent. Mine administrators began to keep records of the major tunnels and shafts, noting distances and directions in the rough terms available before formal surveying became a standard practice. The first reasonably systematic maps of the Wieliczka mine date from the early modern period, the 16th and 17th centuries, when the administrative demands of a large royal enterprise required a more organized understanding of the underground space. These early maps were not accurate in the modern sense. The techniques available for measuring distances and directions underground were imprecise, and the resulting maps reflect the limitations of their instruments and their makers. But they represented a genuine intellectual achievement for their time, an attempt to impose cartographic order on a space that resisted it. One figure who contributed significantly to the understanding of the mine's underground structure was Marcin Germanus, a mining administrator who worked at Wieliczka in the late 16th century and produced some of the earliest detailed written descriptions of the mine's layout. His accounts, preserved in the administrative records of the period, describe the major chambers and tunnels with a precision that was unusual for the time, noting not only the dimensions of spaces, but the materials used in their construction, the water drainage systems, and the methods used to support particularly large or deep excavations. Germanus was not a geologist or an engineer in the modern professional sense, but his careful observation and systematic description contributed to the accumulated knowledge base that allowed the mine to be managed effectively across generations. The tradition of mapping and surveying the mine became progressively more sophisticated over the following centuries. By the 18th and 19th centuries, formal surveying techniques, using theodolites, measuring chains, and careful angular calculations, were being applied to the underground passages, producing maps of considerably greater accuracy. The challenge of underground surveying was distinct from surface mapping in ways that required specific adaptations. The inability to use celestial navigation, the difficulty of measuring angles accurately in confined spaces, the problem of maintaining a consistent reference frame across a structure that extended in 3 dimensions rather than 2. The underground lakes added another dimension to the labyrinth, literally and figuratively. The Wieliczka mine contains several underground lakes, formed in chambers where water has accumulated over time, either through natural seepage from the surrounding rock or through the dissolution of salt by water that found its way into previously sealed spaces. The largest of these, the Wessel Lake, is situated in one of the lower levels and possesses a quality of stillness that is unlike anything achievable on the surface. Its surface, perfectly flat, perfectly reflective, mirroring the salt-gray ceiling above it, with a fidelity that makes the boundary between water and air almost impossible to detect. These lakes are not simply decorative features. They represent points where the mine's engineering and the natural behavior of the surrounding rock intersect in complex ways. The accumulation of water in a closed underground space creates hydrostatic pressure on the surrounding walls, potentially accelerating the dissolution of salt surfaces and affecting the structural behavior of adjacent chambers. Managing the lakes, monitoring their levels, preventing uncontrolled expansion, ensuring that they do not connect with other water bodies in ways that could compromise structural stability, has been a persistent concern for the mine's administrators throughout its history. The underground ecology of these lakes is a matter of ongoing scientific interest. Without sunlight, conventional photosynthesis-based food chains cannot function, and the life that exists in these completely dark, saline waters is limited and specialized. Nevertheless, microbial communities have been identified in the underground lakes of Wieliczka. Single-celled organisms adapted to the extreme salinity and the complete absence of light, deriving their energy from chemical processes rather than photosynthesis. These communities are scientifically interesting because they represent a natural experiment in life adapted to conditions that, in their extremity, have some parallels to environments found elsewhere in the solar system. As the mine deepened across the centuries, the relationship between the upper levels, where most of the decorated chambers and chapels are located, and the lower levels, where active mining continued long after the upper areas had been partly or fully worked out, became increasingly complex. The upper levels represented the mine's past, areas of historical and artistic significance, maintained for their cultural value and increasingly for their tourist value, while the lower levels continued to serve the mine's practical purpose as a working operation. This coexistence of the historical and the active, the preserved and the working, within a single underground structure created management challenges that had no direct parallel in any other institution. The vibrations from mining operations in the lower levels could potentially affect the stability of chambers and artworks in the upper levels. The drainage systems of the lower mine had to be managed without disrupting the carefully controlled environment of the upper areas. The two worlds, the museum and the mine, shared the same physical structure and therefore shared the consequences of everything that happened within it. Can anyone truly understand the full scale of this underground labyrinth? Even those who have spent careers within it would answer carefully. The mine's 300 kilometers of passages have not all been visited in living memory. Some sections, sealed by collapses or deliberately closed for structural reasons, have not been entered by any person for decades. The understanding of the whole structure that exists today is built from centuries of accumulated mapping from modern surveying techniques, including laser scanning and digital modeling, from the institutional memory of the mine's administrators and engineers, and from the ongoing work of the researchers and archaeologists who continue to investigate the mine's physical and historical fabric. But even with all of this, the labyrinth retains its mystery, not the dramatic mystery of undiscovered treasure or unexplained phenomena, but the quieter mystery of a space too large and too complex to be fully held in any single mind, a structure that exceeds the comprehension of any individual, that requires the collective attention of generations to even partially understand. And that continues to yield new information to those patient enough to look carefully at its walls, its floors, and the spaces between. The labyrinth continues to exist in the dark, whether anyone is walking through it or not. It waits as the salt itself has always waited, patient beyond any human measure of patience, holding its passages and its chambers in the unchanging coolness of the underground, indifferent to the passage of time in a way that only very ancient things can be. Every place that has been inhabited long enough develops stories about itself. These stories are not history, though they often grow from historical soil. They are something different, a community's way of making sense of the place it occupies, of investing the landscape with meaning that goes beyond the merely factual, of answering questions that the documentary record cannot address with the intimacy and the emotional resonance that human beings require. The Wieliczka mine has its stories. They are old and they are layered, and they belong to a tradition of oral transmission that stretches back across many centuries of mining community life. They should be understood and appreciated as folklore, as expressions of the beliefs, values, and imaginative life of the people who lived and worked in the mine, rather than as historical accounts of events that occurred in the way the stories describe. With that distinction clearly made, the stories are worth telling. The most important of them concerns Saint Kinga, and it begins not in Poland, but in Hungary. According to the legend, when the young Princess Kinga of Hungary was betrothed to Bolesław of Poland, her father asked what gift she desired as part of her wedding settlement. The princess, knowing that her future kingdom had no significant salt deposits, and that salt was among the most valuable commodities a medieval kingdom could possess, asked her father for a salt mine. The king granted her request, and Kinga went to the great salt mine of Maramureș in Hungary, where she knelt and removed her betrothal ring and dropped it into the mine shaft. She then departed for Poland. When she arrived, the legend continues, she was taken to the area near Wieliczka, where signs of salt near the surface had been noticed. She instructed the local people to dig at a specific location, and when they dug, they found not only salt, but within the salt, perfectly preserved after its long journey underground, the ring that she had dropped into the Hungarian mine. The salt of Wieliczka, the legend proposes, had traveled underground from Hungary to Poland, carrying with it the princess's ring as proof of its miraculous origin. The mine in this telling was not discovered or developed by human industry and geological accident. It was given as a gift, through divine mediation, by a woman of faith whose ring had sanctified the deposit that would sustain Poland for centuries. The geological implausibility of this story is obvious. The salt deposits of Maramureș and Wieliczka are hundreds of kilometers apart, separated by the Carpathian Mountains, and there is no underground connection between them. Geology does not support the story as a literal account of physical events, but understanding the story as legend rather than geology opens up its real meaning. Kinga's legend is a story about the sacred nature of the mine, about the idea that the extraordinary resource beneath Wieliczka was not simply a commercial accident, but a providential gift, entrusted to Poland through the intercession of a holy woman. It is a story that gives the miners' daily labor a spiritual dimension. They are not merely extracting a commodity, but working within a space that has been sanctified by the passage of something sacred through it. The ring at the bottom of the mine, carried by faith across the mountains, redeems the darkness of the underground and makes it holy ground. This transformation of the mine's meaning from purely economic space to sacred space helps explain why the tradition of underground worship at Wieliczka was so persistent and so deeply felt. The miners who carved shrines into the salt walls, who maintained candles before figures of saints at their working faces, who eventually carved entire chapels from the rock around them, were acting within a tradition that understood the mine itself as a place where faith and labor were inseparably intertwined. Other legends concern the underground spirits, beings that the mining tradition across Central Europe imagined as inhabiting the underground world alongside the human workers. These spirits took various forms in different traditions. At Wieliczka, the most commonly referenced underground beings were called the Skarbnik, a term that translates roughly as the treasure keeper or the mine guardian. The Skarbnik was imagined as an old man who lived deep in the mine, sometimes appearing to miners as a warning of danger and sometimes as a source of mischief. He was not precisely malevolent in the way that a demon or a monster would be, but he was unpredictable and required respect. Miners who behaved arrogantly underground, who wasted salt or treated the mine carelessly, might find the Skarbnik working against them, leading them astray in the tunnels, causing the lights to fail, or giving false signs of safety before a collapse. Miners who treated the mine with care and who showed proper humility, both toward the Skarbnik and toward the dangerous environment around them, might, according to the tradition, receive the spirit's protection. The Skarbnik might warn a careful miner away from a passage that was about to collapse, or guide a lost worker back toward a familiar tunnel. This tradition should be understood in its proper context. The miners of Wieliczka were working in a genuinely dangerous environment where the line between safety and disaster could be very thin, and where the difference between a safe decision and an unsafe one was not always obvious even to experienced men. The concept of a mine guardian, a presence that rewarded respectful behavior and punished arrogance, was a way of encoding important behavioral norms. The miner who imagined the Skarbnik watching his every action underground was a miner who was likely to be more careful, more attentive, and more respectful of the signs of danger around him. Folklore, in this sense, was not merely entertainment or superstition. It was a practical framework for navigating a dangerous world, a set of stories that, when taken seriously, encouraged exactly the behaviors that made underground work safer and more sustainable. Other stories explained the natural features of the mine in ways that satisfied the imagination more fully than geological accounts could. Underground lakes were described as connected to distant bodies of water, sometimes to the Vistula, sometimes to mythological underground rivers. Unusual formations in the salt walls were explained as petrified figures, a miner caught in a collapse who had been transformed into salt, a monument to the mine's dangers preserved in the very material that had caused his death. The acoustic properties of certain chambers, spaces where sound behaved unexpectedly, where voices seemed to come from the walls, where footsteps produced echoes from directions that made no physical sense, gave rise to stories of underground presences that could be heard but not seen. Voices from sections of the mine long sealed and forgotten. There were also the stories that surrounded the horses, the animals that lived underground for years, pulling loads through the salt corridors in the dim light of miners' lamps. Horses that had spent long periods underground were sometimes described as losing their sense of light and dark entirely, becoming accustomed to the mine's constant dimness to the degree that daylight, on the rare occasions they were brought to the surface, caused them discomfort. Whether this was strictly true in all cases, or whether it was embellished in the telling, the stories about the underground horses carried a particular kind of pathos, the image of a creature so thoroughly adapted to an artificial world that the natural one had become strange to it. This story resonated with the miners in ways that probably needed no explanation. A man who spent his working life underground, who descended each morning and ascended each evening, year after year, decade after decade, might reasonably feel that the underground world had become, in some sense, more familiar than the surface one. The mine had its rhythms, its landmarks, its community, its particular quality of silence and sound. It was not comfortable in the way that warmth and sunlight are comfortable, but it was known, and known places, however strange to outsiders, become home. The legends of Wieliczka were at their core stories about belonging. They said, "This place, this dark and difficult and dangerous place, is ours. We have been here long enough to understand it, long enough to name its spirits, long enough to tell stories about its origins that explain why it exists and why we are here within it. The salt is not simply a mineral, it is a gift. The darkness is not simply the absence of light, it is a home." That sense of belonging, expressed in stories rather than in administrative records, in carvings rather than in official documents, is as much a part of the history of Wieliczka as any engineering achievement or royal decree. It is the part of history that lived in the imaginations of the people who made everything else possible. One of the more unexpected qualities of the Wieliczka mine is the air. Visitors often notice it within the first few minutes of the descent, a change in the quality of the atmosphere that is difficult to name precisely but immediately perceptible. The air is cool, as expected, around 14 degrees Celsius throughout the year regardless of the season above ground. It is also noticeably humid, carrying moisture from the surrounding rock in concentrations that vary slightly between levels and locations. But beyond the temperature and the humidity, there is something else, a particular cleanness, a quality of freshness that seems contradictory in an underground environment, a sense that each breath carries something beneficial rather than merely inoffensive. This quality is not imagined. It has a scientific explanation rooted in the specific chemistry of the mine's atmosphere. The air within the Wieliczka mine contains elevated concentrations of sodium chloride, salt particles suspended in the air, released from the salt walls and floor by the slow process of surface evaporation. These particles are extremely fine, much finer than the coarse grains of table salt, fine enough to remain suspended in air for extended periods rather than settling immediately. When inhaled, they penetrate into the respiratory tract and interact with the mucous membranes in ways that have been observed to have therapeutic effects on certain conditions, particularly conditions affecting the airways, including asthma, chronic bronchitis, and some allergic respiratory conditions. This therapeutic quality of the mine's atmosphere was recognized empirically long before it was understood scientifically. As early as the mid-19th century, physicians working in the Wieliczka area noticed that miners, despite working in conditions that were in many ways physically demanding and potentially hazardous, showed significantly lower rates of respiratory disease compared to workers in other industries. A Polish physician named Felix Bykowski documented this observation in the 1840s, noting the apparent respiratory health of the miners and suggesting a connection to the salt-rich atmosphere in which they spent their working hours. Bykowski's observations were careful and methodical for their time, and they established the beginning of what became a more systematic investigation of the mine's therapeutic potential. He proposed that the mine's environment might benefit patients with respiratory conditions, and he began bringing patients, some of them suffering from the serious lung diseases that were common in 19th century industrial populations, down into the mine for extended periods of rest and breathing in the salt atmosphere. The results were encouraging enough to formalize into a practice. By the second half of the 19th century, the therapeutic use of the mine's atmosphere had become an established, if informal, activity, with patients spending hours or days in the underground environment. This practice, called speleotherapy or halotherapy in its various forms, continued to develop through the 20th century, and Wieliczka today maintains a dedicated underground health resort within the mine, where patients with respiratory conditions can undergo structured treatment courses in the salt-rich atmosphere. The scientific understanding of why the salt atmosphere produces these effects has been refined considerably over the decades. The fine salt particles, when inhaled, appear to assist in clearing mucus from the airways, an anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial effect that is particularly relevant for conditions characterized by chronic airway inflammation. The temperature and humidity levels of the mine's air are consistently cool and moderately humid, create conditions that are generally easier on irritated airways than the variable and often polluted air of the surface. The absence of the biological allergens that trigger many people's respiratory symptoms, pollen, mold spores, dust mite particles, contributes to the relative comfort many patients experience underground. The same chemical properties of salt that make the mine's air therapeutically interesting also underlie one of the most significant preservation challenges facing the site: the relationship between salt, moisture, and the carved artworks and structures within the mine. Salt is, paradoxically, both the material that makes the mine's artworks possible and the material that presents the greatest threat to their long-term survival. The salt sculptures, the bas-reliefs, the chandeliers, the carved pillars and altarpieces, all of these are made from the same material as the walls and floor around them, and they are subject to the same physical and chemical processes that affect the surrounding rock. The primary preservation concern is moisture. Salt, when exposed to air of varying humidity, absorbs and releases water in cycles that cause the surface of the rock to expand and contract slightly with each moisture cycle. Over time, this cyclic expansion and contraction causes the surface of salt sculptures to degrade, small crystals detach, fine details become blurred, sharp edges soften, and eventually disappear. In extreme cases, larger pieces of material can separate from the surface, causing significant and irreversible damage to carved works. Managing the humidity of the mine's atmosphere is therefore a critical conservation priority. The Wieliczka mine maintains a sophisticated monitoring system that tracks temperature and humidity levels throughout the tourist and heritage areas of the mine, with particular attention to the spaces containing the most significant carved works. When humidity levels in a given area rise above threshold values, typically caused by the presence of large numbers of visitors who carry moisture into the mine on their clothing and in their breath, intervention measures can be employed to restore the atmospheric balance. The number of visitors that can safely be admitted to the mine at any one time is therefore not simply a logistical question, but a conservation one. Each person entering the mine introduces a small additional load of moisture into the underground atmosphere. Multiply that across the approximately 1.5 million visitors who now come to Wieliczka each year, and the cumulative effect on the mine's atmosphere, and therefore on its precious carved surfaces, is significant. This is one of the conservation dilemmas that UNESCO and the mine's management team have had to address since Wieliczka was inscribed on the World Heritage List in 1978, notably in the very first year of the list's operation, which reflects the international community's immediate recognition of the site's exceptional value. The UNESCO inscription brought with it not only recognition, but responsibility. World Heritage status requires that the managing authorities demonstrate active, systematic efforts to preserve the outstanding universal value of the site, the qualities that justified its inscription, for the benefit of future generations. For Wieliczka, those qualities are specific: the exceptional underground mine complex with its chapels, sculptures, and historic engineering structures, the geological significance of the salt deposit, and the extraordinary testimony the mine provides to human ingenuity and craftsmanship across many centuries. Meeting these responsibilities requires ongoing scientific monitoring, conservation treatment of vulnerable artworks, structural assessment of the historic engineering infrastructure, and management of the visitor experience in ways that balance access with preservation. The conservation of the timber structures, the historic wooden frameworks that support the tunnels and chambers of the older levels, is particularly challenging. Wood underground is subject to decay from moisture and biological attack by fungi and wood-boring organisms. The timbers that were installed in the mine centuries ago are, in many cases, no longer structurally functional. They have been replaced by modern steel and concrete supports, but they retain significant historical value as evidence of the techniques used by the mine's early engineers. Preserving these historic timbers in situ without removing them for laboratory treatment requires specialized conservation approaches that are still being refined. The underground ecology of the mine, the community of microorganisms that inhabits its walls, floors, and water bodies, adds another dimension to the preservation challenge. Some microbial communities are benign or even beneficial, playing a role in maintaining the chemical stability of the underground environment. Others are potentially harmful to the mine's historic fabric. Certain fungi and bacteria produce acids or other compounds that can attack the surface of salt and degrade both the rock and any organic materials in contact with it. Understanding which microbial communities are present, where they are most active, and how the mine's management practices affect them is an active area of microbiological research. The relationship between science and the mine, which began with Bixkowski's observations in the 1840s, has therefore grown into something considerably more complex and more multidisciplinary. The mine is simultaneously a therapeutic environment, an archaeological site, a geological resource, a conservation challenge, a microbiological laboratory, and a functioning tourist destination. And the management of all these roles without allowing anyone to compromise the others requires a degree of institutional sophistication that takes many years to develop. The salt endures, as it has always endured, a patient and mineral and indifferent to human concerns. But the human responsibility for what has been made within it grows more rather than less demanding with each passing decade. There is a particular kind of rediscovery that does not involve finding something lost. It is the rediscovery that happens when something familiar is looked at again with fresh attention, when an object or a place that has been known for a long time is suddenly understood differently, seen more clearly, appreciated more fully, because the tools or the knowledge or simply the willingness to look carefully have finally caught up with the thing being observed. This is the kind of rediscovery that has characterized the modern engagement with the Wieliczka mine. The mine was never forgotten. It was never abandoned and then stumbled upon by explorers clearing undergrowth from an overgrown entrance. It was never the subject of a dramatic archaeological revelation in the way that some ancient sites have been, no sealed chamber broken open, no inscription decoded, no buried structure revealed by satellite imagery. Wieliczka has been continuously known, continuously documented, and continuously visited for centuries. The kings of Poland knew it. The artists who visited Krakow in the 18th century knew it. The tourists who began arriving in organized groups during the 19th century knew it. And yet the depth of understanding that now exists about the mine, its full structural complexity, its historical layering, its archaeological significance, the precise character of its microclimate, the complete catalogue of its carved artworks, is something that has been built very largely in the past 50 years. Through the application of modern research methods to a site whose surface has always been accessible, but whose interior has always exceeded easy comprehension. The formal archaeological investigation of Wieliczka is a relatively recent development, and it has produced results that have modified and enriched the historical understanding of the mine in important ways. The mine's administrative records, which stretch back to the medieval period and constitute one of the most substantial archives of any pre-modern industrial enterprise in Europe, provide a documentary framework, dates, names, economic figures, administrative decisions. But the physical fabric of the mine itself contains information that the records do not, and recovering that information requires the patient, systematic work of archaeological investigation. One of the most productive areas of recent archaeological work at Wieliczka has been the study of the mine's oldest surviving timber structures. In the deepest and least visited sections of the upper levels, fragments of very early wooden framing survive, beams and posts that have been preserved by the same stable, cool, salt-rich environment that has protected the mine's carved artworks. These timbers can be dated with considerable precision using dendrochronology, the analysis of tree ring patterns in wood, and the dates obtained from them have allowed archaeologists to establish a more accurate chronology of the mine's early development than the documentary record alone could provide. Some of the dendrochronological dates obtained from Wieliczka timbers have been surprising. Certain beams have been shown to be older than the earliest written references to active underground mining at the site, suggesting that the transition from surface brine collection to actual underground excavation may have begun somewhat earlier than the documentary record indicates, or that early mining activity was conducted at a scale too small to appear prominently in the administrative records that have survived. This kind of archaeology, the archaeology of industrial sites, of places where the traces of human activity are embedded in the practical fabric of a working enterprise, rather than in the more obviously dramatic deposits of a settlement or a monument, requires considerable specialist knowledge and considerable patience. The evidence is often fragmentary, the context complex, and the interpretive challenges substantial. But the rewards, in terms of the historical understanding that emerges, justify the investment. The application of digital survey technologies to the mine has been another major development of recent decades. Laser scanning, the use of instruments that emit millions of precise laser pulses in all directions and record the distances to the surrounding surfaces, building up a three-dimensional point cloud that represents the scanned space with millimeter-level accuracy, has been applied to significant areas of the Wieliczka mine. Producing digital models of unprecedented detail and precision, these models serve multiple purposes. They provide a baseline record of the current condition of the mine's physical fabric, walls, ceilings, floors, carved artworks, timber structures, against which future changes can be measured. They enable structural engineers to analyze the geometry of chambers and tunnels with a precision that was not previously achievable, identifying areas where the shape of an excavation deviates from the design, or where subtle deformation suggests developing instability. They allow conservators to plan and monitor treatment of carved surfaces without the need for direct contact. And they make the mine accessible in a limited but genuine sense to researchers and members of the public who cannot physically visit. The digital model can be navigated on screen, allowing detailed examination of spaces that are not open to general visitors. The digital mapping project at Wieliczka is one of the most comprehensive ever undertaken at an underground heritage site, and the data it has generated continues to be analyzed and interpreted years after the initial survey work was completed. Among the findings that have emerged from careful analysis of the survey data is a more precise understanding of the structural condition of the mine's oldest chambers, the spaces carved in the earliest centuries of the mine's operation, where the surrounding rock has had the longest time to adjust to the excavation, and where the behavior of the structure is most difficult to predict. The visitor experience at Wieliczka has itself been the subject of thoughtful reconsideration in recent decades, an attempt to make the extraordinary heritage of the mine accessible to the widest possible audience while preserving the qualities that make the experience meaningful. The standard tourist route through the mine, which takes visitors through the most significant chambers and chapels on the upper levels, has been carefully designed to tell a coherent story. To introduce visitors to the mine's geology, its history, its engineering, and its artistic and religious heritage in a sequence that builds understanding progressively. The route passes through chambers that represent different periods of the mine's development, from the earliest workings to the great decorated halls of the 18th and 19th centuries, allowing the visitor to experience something of the mine's temporal depth as well as its physical extent. Beyond the standard tourist route, the mine offers a range of more specialized experiences, extended tour that penetrate further into the historic levels, tour focused specifically on the mine's geological features, and the therapeutic stays in the underground health resort. These options acknowledge the diversity of the interests that bring people to Wieliczka and attempt to serve each of them appropriately. The UNESCO World Heritage designation has brought international attention and international support to the mine's preservation efforts, but it has also brought the challenge of managing a site that attracts visitors in numbers that were not anticipated when the original management systems were designed. The approximately 1.5 million visitors who now come to Wieliczka each year represent a significant logistical and conservation challenge, large enough to require careful management of visitor flows, atmospheric conditions, and physical wear on the mine's surfaces, but small enough that the mine has not yet faced the kind of over-tourism crisis that has affected some other World Heritage sites. The balance between access and preservation, between sharing the mine's extraordinary heritage with as many people as possible and protecting that heritage for the generations who have not yet been born, is one that the mine's management continues to navigate with care and with the benefit of the scientific monitoring systems that now provide a detailed, real-time picture of the underground environment. What emerges from a careful look at the modern history of engagement with Wieliczka is a picture of institutional learning, of an organization that has grown more sophisticated in its understanding of what it holds in trust, more rigorous in its methods of protecting it, and more thoughtful in its approach to sharing it. The mine has been known for centuries, but the depth of knowledge now brought to bear on understanding, preserving, and interpreting it is genuinely new, a rediscovery not of the place itself, but of the full meaning and value of what that place contains. Every careful look at the mine's walls, every dendrochronological date from an ancient beam, every laser scan of a carved relief, every microbiological sample from an underground lake, all of it adds to an understanding that grows more complete with each passing year. And yet completeness, here as in so many things, remains a horizon rather than a destination. The deepest levels of the Wieliczka mine are quiet in a way that the upper levels, with their visitor routes and electric lighting, are not. At 300 meters below the surface, The weight of the overlying rock is a felt presence, not dramatic, not threatening in any immediate sense, but simply there a constant reminder of the enormous mass of earth and stone that exists in every direction except the way one came in. The temperature is the same as it is at shallower depths, around 14 degrees, but something about the depth itself changes the quality of the silence. It is not merely the absence of sound. It is a silence that has thickness to it, that seems to press against the hearing in a way that the mind interprets as fullness rather than emptiness. Not all of the mine's 300 kilometers of passages are accessible. Not all of them are safe to enter. Not all of them have been entered in recent memory, and some of them, sealed by deliberate decision or by the natural processes of rock movement and collapse, have not been visited by any person in decades. These closed sections of the mine exist for various reasons. Some were sealed during the active mining period, when the salt in a given area was exhausted, and the worked-out passages were no longer economically necessary to maintain. Others were closed in response to structural concerns, areas where the behavior of the surrounding rock suggested developing instability, where the risk of collapse made continued access inadvisable. Still others were isolated by accidents, passages blocked by falls of material that were never cleared because the effort required exceeded the benefit of reopening them. In all of these closed sections, time has continued to pass in the dark. The structures within them, timber frames, carved surfaces. Equipment left in place when the area was abandoned, have continued to be subject to the same physical and chemical processes that affect the accessible parts of the mine, but without the monitoring, the conservation intervention, or the human presence that characterizes the managed areas. Some of these structures have certainly deteriorated significantly. Others, protected by the same stable underground environment that has preserved so much elsewhere in the mine, may be in considerably better condition than one might expect. This is one of the reasons that the closed sections of Wieliczka are of genuine archaeological interest. In a mine that has been continuously operated and managed for many centuries, the actively used areas have been subject to continuous modification. Structures repaired, surfaces cleaned, equipment replaced, spaces repurposed. The historical integrity of these areas has been partially compromised by the very processes of maintenance and use that kept them accessible. The closed sections, by contrast, preserve a more complete record of their condition at the time of abandonment, a snapshot, frozen in the stable underground environment, of the mine as it existed at a specific moment in its history. The archaeological potential of these spaces is considerable but difficult to access. Opening a sealed section of the mine requires structural assessment to determine whether entry is safe, a process that may itself require drilling or other intrusive investigation before any direct access can be attempted. The cost and complexity of such assessments means that sealed sections are opened only when there is a compelling reason to do so, either because of structural concerns that require investigation from both sides of a seal, or because specific historical evidence suggests that a sealed area contains information of particular significance. The structural monitoring program at Wieliczka is itself one of the most comprehensive of its kind applied to any underground heritage site, throughout the accessible areas of the mine. And at key points in the surrounding structure, an array of sensors continuously records data relevant to the mine's stability. Displacement sensors that detect any movement of the rock mass, water level gauges in the underground lakes, and drainage systems, atmospheric sensors tracking temperature and humidity. Seismic monitors recording vibrations from nearby road traffic and historically from mining operations in the lower levels. This data is analyzed continuously, and patterns that suggest developing instability are flagged for engineering review. The mine's structural monitoring system has, over the decades it has been in operation, identified several areas of concern at stages early enough to permit intervention before any significant damage occurred, reinforcing the value of continuous monitoring over purely reactive inspection. The ongoing research programs at Wieliczka extend beyond structural monitoring into historical, geological, and ecological investigation. Geological sampling of the salt deposit continues to refine the scientific understanding of the mine's stratigraphic sequence, the specific arrangement of different salt varieties and interbedded non-salt layers that reflects the detailed history of the Miocene sea, whose evaporation created the deposit. Each new sample, analyzed with modern geochemical techniques, adds data points to a picture of ancient environmental conditions that grows more detailed and more nuanced with each study. The microbiological research program, investigating the communities of salt-tolerant microorganisms that inhabit the mine's walls and water bodies, has produced findings of interest not only to the conservation program, but to the broader scientific community studying life in extreme environments. Some of the microbial species identified in the Wieliczka mine have not been previously described, organisms new to science, living quietly in the salt and the dark, whose existence was unknown until researchers looked carefully at what lives in the underground world. New discoveries, in other words, are still being made at Wieliczka, not the dramatic discoveries of popular imagination, no sealed treasury, no lost tomb, no hidden inscription that rewrites history, but the patient, careful discoveries of science, new species, new dates, new structural measurements, new details of historical practice recovered from the physical evidence of the mine itself, continue to emerge from the ongoing engagement with the site. There is also the question of the deeper levels, the sections of the mine below the tourist areas, where active salt extraction continued until the 20th century, and where the scale and character of the workings differ significantly from the historic upper levels. These deeper areas have their own archaeological and historical significance. They represent the mine's more recent industrial history, the continuation of the mining tradition into the era of mechanized extraction, and the final chapters of Wieliczka as a working mine rather than a heritage site. Their investigation and interpretation is a project still largely in its early stages. The mine officially ceased commercial salt production in 1996, after more than 7 centuries of continuous operation. The cessation of active mining did not end the mine's institutional life. The management of the site as a heritage destination, a therapeutic facility, and a subject of ongoing research continues to employ a substantial workforce. But it did change the fundamental character of the place. The mine that had been, for most of its history, primarily a place of work became primarily a place of memory. That transition from working mine to living museum is itself a historical event of significance, and its consequences are still being worked through. The practices, the knowledge, and the physical skills of salt mining, the understanding of how to read salt rock, how to support an underground chamber, how to navigate a 300-kilometer labyrinth by experience rather than by map, are knowledge forms that existed in living people and that are now slowly passing out of direct practice. The miners who worked the deepest levels in the final decades of active extraction carry knowledge that is, in the most literal sense, irreplaceable knowledge that no archive or digital survey can fully capture, because it lived in hands and eyes and bodies rather than in documents. Efforts to record this knowledge through oral history interviews, through the documentation of practical techniques, through the involvement of retired miners in the interpretation of the mine's heritage, are ongoing, but the window for such recording narrows with each passing year. What still remains hidden at Wieliczka then is not a single dramatic secret, but a constellation of smaller ones. The sealed passages that preserve their contents in the dark, the microbiological communities that have not yet been sampled, the structural behaviors that have not yet been fully modeled, the oral histories that have not yet been recorded, the geological details that have not yet been analyzed. Even after centuries of exploration, parts of the underground world still remain quietly beyond everyday visitors. And the mine keeps its own counsel about what it holds, patient as salt, silent as the dark between the lights. The ascent from the mine is slower than the descent. Not physically, the same wooden staircase that brought one down is there for the return, its creaking steps as familiar on the way up as they were on the way down. But something about the mine's relationship to the experience has shifted over the hours spent underground, and the return to daylight feels less like a simple reversal of the descent and more like a transition between two different states of being. The first signs of the surface world return gradually, in the same order that they disappeared on the way down, a faint brightening of the light above, a change in the quality of the air, the return of sounds that the underground had absorbed entirely. A distant vehicle. A bird, wind moving through leaves somewhere above the shaft opening. These sounds arrive first as novelties, distinct, slightly surprising, recognized, but somehow unexpected, before settling back into the ordinary background of the waking world. Then the light. It comes as a pale rectangle above the staircase, growing slowly wider and brighter as the last flights of steps are climbed until suddenly, not gradually, but suddenly, in the way that transitions between darkness and brightness always feel sudden even when anticipated. The open air is there and the sky is above. And the morning or the afternoon or whatever part of the day the surface is holding is waiting with its ordinary, extraordinary light. It takes the eyes a moment to adjust. And in that moment of adjustment, something useful can happen, a pause between two worlds, a breath between what was underground and what will be above, in which the experience of the mine can be held briefly whole before it begins the inevitable process of settling into memory. What the mine offers to anyone who has walked through its passages and stood in its chapels and looked at its carved walls and breathed its particular salt-rich air is an encounter with something that is genuinely difficult to categorize. It is not a natural wonder in the strict sense. The geological deposit is natural, but what has been made within it is entirely human. It is not an architectural monument in the usual sense. It was not designed by architects working from blueprints, but grew organically across centuries in response to the practical demands of mining and the personal impulses of the people who worked there. It is not a museum in the conventional sense, though it contains objects and spaces of enormous historical and artistic significance. The mine is itself the artifact, the whole of it, inseparable from the history and the people it embodies. It is, perhaps, most accurately described as a landscape, an underground landscape shaped by human hands over many centuries that reflects the full complexity of the lives lived within it. The geological underpinning of that landscape was laid down 13 million years ago by the patient chemistry of an ancient sea. The human contribution began perhaps 8 centuries ago with the first careful shafts sunk into the salt-bearing rock. And between those two starting points, the geological and the historical, everything that exists in the mine was made, one careful act at a time. The engineering that keeps the mine standing is, in itself, a form of artistry, not the artistry of aesthetic intention, but the artistry of accumulated knowledge applied with consistent care across time. The pillar systems, the timber frames, the drainage channels. The ventilation schemes, these are not beautiful in any obvious sense, but they are beautiful in the way that all genuinely functional things made with real understanding are beautiful. They fit their purpose so precisely, so efficiently, so faithfully over such a long duration, that the fit itself becomes something to admire. The chapels are beautiful in a more immediately recognizable way. The carved reliefs, the chandeliers, the altarpieces, the smooth grey floors that reflect the chandelier light in quiet pools. But the beauty of the chapels is inseparable from the context in which they exist. They are beautiful not in spite of being underground, not in spite of being made by working men with mining tools in their hours of rest, but specifically because of these things. A chapel of comparable size and quality at the surface would be impressive. Underground, carved from the same salt that surrounds it on all sides, made by people who spent their daily lives in the dark and who chose to spend their free hours making something that transcended the darkness. It is something else entirely. It is the product of a kind of devotion that does not require a name or a philosophy or a formal tradition to recognize. It is the devotion of people who took the material of their daily labor and used it to make something for each other, something that said, in the particular language of carved stone and candlelight, that this place is more than a mine. That the darkness is not merely darkness, that the hours spent underground are not merely hours of toil, but hours in which human beings are fully present, fully themselves, fully capable of beauty. The miners of Wieliczka, the medieval miners who sank the first shafts and learned to read the salt, the early modern miners who built the timber frameworks and managed the horses and watched the candles. The 19th century miner artists who spent their free hours carving chapels from the rock, none of them set out to create a World Heritage Site. None of them would have recognized that phrase or understood what it meant. They were doing what people have always done in difficult places: surviving, working, building community, making meaning, leaving traces. The traces they left happened to be, in their accumulated totality, one of the most extraordinary underground spaces that human beings have ever created. There is something in this that feels important to sit with for a moment, in the way that important things sometimes require, not rushed toward a conclusion, but allowed to be present in its full, unhurried meaning. The people who made Wieliczka were not extraordinary in the way that historical narratives usually describe extraordinary people. They were not kings or generals or artists of formal reputation. Most of their names are not recorded. Most of their individual contributions cannot be identified or attributed. They were ordinary people doing ordinary work, difficult work, dangerous work, work that consumed most of their waking hours and asked much of their bodies. And in the course of doing that work, they made something permanent. That permanence is not incidental to the story. It is the story. Every carved pillar in the mine is permanent. Every chapel, every relief, every smooth corridor floor, all of it will outlast the people who made it by centuries, probably by millennia. The salt preserves what is placed within it with a faithfulness that is almost indistinguishable from care. The underground environment, stable and cool, and sealed from the weathering forces that erode everything on the surface, keeps the mine's contents in a state of preservation that surface monuments rarely achieve. The permanence of the mine's fabric means that the people who made it are, in a sense, still present, not as ghosts or as historical abstractions, but as physical traces in the material world. The chisel mark in the salt wall was made by a specific hand, at a specific moment, with a specific tool. That moment is gone, and the person who made the mark is gone, but the mark itself remains, a direct physical connection across whatever interval of time separates the making from the looking. To run a finger along the groove of a chisel mark in the salt wall of the Wieliczka mine is to touch something that a specific human being touched, made, and left behind. That kind of connection to the past, tactile, immediate, direct, is rare. And it is one of the quieter gifts that the mine offers to anyone who walks through it with sufficient attention. The town of Wieliczka above will be going about its evening by the time the last visitor has ascended the staircase, and the doors of the mine building have been closed for the day. The square will be settling into its evening routine, the particular, comfortable rhythm of a small European town as it transitions from afternoon to dusk. A few lights will come on in the windows above the street. The church bells, which rang this morning as the day began, will ring again as the evening deepens. Someone will cross the cobblestones with unhurried steps, not thinking about what lies beneath them, simply going about the ordinary business of an ordinary evening in an unremarkable town in the south of Poland. And below, in the dark, the mine will be exactly as it has always been. The temperature will be 14 degrees, as it was this morning, as it was last year, as it was a century ago. The salt walls will glimmer faintly in the residual light from the electric lamps before those too are extinguished. The underground lakes will be perfectly still, their surfaces reflecting nothing once the lights are gone, simply dark water in dark air, as quiet as any water anywhere on earth. The carved figures in the chapels will be as they have always been, patient, still, shaped from the same salt that surrounds them, belonging entirely to the underground world that made them possible. The corridors will stretch on in every direction, 300 kilometers of them, most of them dark now, most of them quiet, carrying within their salt walls the accumulated evidence of 8 centuries of human presence. The timber beams, some of them ancient beyond any easy reckoning, will continue their slow geological work of holding the ceiling in place. The pillars of salt, evenly spaced through the older chambers, will continue bearing their load with the same patient efficiency they have always provided. Nothing dramatic will happen in the mine tonight. Nothing dramatic happens there on most nights. The mine simply exists as it has existed, quietly and continuously, beneath the ordinary streets of an ordinary town, for longer than most institutions in the world have been imagined. And in the morning, the bells will ring again above the square. The doors will open. The first visitors of the day will descend the wooden staircase into the cool, mineral-scented air. And the mine will receive them, as it has always received the people who come into its darkness, with the same still, patient, unhurried quality that belongs to very old things that have learned, across many centuries, that time is not something to be rushed. Long after visitors return to the daylight, the silent corridors beneath Wieliczka will continue preserving the patient work of countless hands that slowly transformed stone into history. The salt endures, the work remains, and the darkness, for all these centuries, has been holding it carefully. If you are finding this documentary peaceful and settling, we would love to have you with us for more journeys like this one. Please consider leaving a like on this video. It helps others find their way here too. And if you have not already, subscribing to History Sleepy Time means you will never miss a new story. We would also love to know where you are watching from tonight, so please leave a comment below before you drift off. Now rest easy and let the quiet corridors of the salt mine carry you gently towards sleep.